Tariffs have once again become a hot topic in economic debates ever since Donald Trump won the US election and started using them both as a bargaining chip and as a way to address many economic issues. His economic nationalism looks back to the 19th century, when tariffs were the main trade policy in the United States, a policy that some say kept income tax at zero and helped domestic industries thrive. So if tariffs worked for the US once, could they work again? At the very least, it's an idea worth looking into because tariffs might free up government funds to lower taxes while reviving America's old industrial regions. Even those who usually support global trade agree that there are some good reasons to use tariffs. This is why big, fast-growing economies like India, Brazil, and even China still rely on tariffs a lot. But the world is very different from when the US last used tariffs as extensively as what is being proposed today. American consumers now enjoy cheap products made through long, complex global supply chains that depend on low trade barriers. Introducing new tariffs could force companies that import goods to raise their prices just to cover the extra costs. In effect, tariffs become a hidden tax on consumers. Even so, the benefits of tariffs, such as boosting domestic industry, creating jobs, and serving strategic goals, might still be worth a small loss in consumer buying power. Of course, this issue has become very political. However, at its core, a tariff is simply an economic tool. Like a wrench, it isn't good or bad by itself. If you need to tighten or loosen a bolt, a wrench is useful. But if you have to perform brain surgery, you'd want something much more precise. The point is that broad, one-size-fits-all statements about tariffs are too simple. Tariffs have different effects in different markets, and you have to weigh the benefits and costs carefully. In today's world, nuance is more important than ever. So we have a few questions to answer. How do tariffs work? What lessons can we learn from examples like chickens and washing machines? And finally, why might tariffs still be worthwhile, even if they come with some economic costs? I write a lot, whether I'm scripting videos for Economics Explained or drafting important emails. So, clear and simple communication is very important to me. But sometimes writing isn't easy, especially when you face a blank page or need to reword something for the 10th time. Tariffs are a form of government intervention that falls under protectionism or economic nationalism. The basic idea is that by taxing imports, these goods become more expensive. As a result, locally made products become cheaper by comparison, and consumers switch from imported goods to domestic ones. This shift can boost investment, create jobs, and support industrial growth in the local economy, while also adding extra revenue for the government. This idea is known as import substitution industrialization. Many countries have used tariffs in the past to build up their own industries, but the United States is one of the few whose growth story is so closely linked with tariffs. This makes it a bit ironic today, when the US is known as a leader in global free trade. After the US Constitution was ratified, one of the very first laws passed in 1789 dealt with tariffs. The famous Alexander Hamilton respected Adam Smith's ideas about the invisible hand of free markets, but did not agree that free trade alone would help build national wealth. Hamilton believed that, as the US established its institutions and became politically independent, it still needed to develop its own manufacturing base to be truly independent from Britain. At that time, Europe was already in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, producing goods like steel, textiles, chemicals, precision instruments, and machinery on a large scale and at low prices. In contrast, US industry lagged behind due to less infrastructure, capital, and skilled workers. It couldn't compete with European products in a free market, even with high technological barriers in international trade back then. That's why tariffs were introduced, to raise the price of European imports, encouraging entrepreneurs to start businesses in the US, and fostering domestic industrial growth. Tariff rates continued to rise into the late 1800s, with averages eventually exceeding 40% on many goods. And it worked. American industries took off. Tariffs made up 90% of federal revenue, and the government was so used to collecting revenue this way that income tax didn't even exist until 1910. However, tariffs were controversial even then. While they helped industrialize the North, the high tariffs hurt the agricultural South, which suffered when European countries imposed their own tariffs on southern exports like cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, goods produced by slave labor. The South depended on these exports for income, and the Merrill tariff became one more grievance for states already upset over Lincoln's election and his plans to end slavery. In short, the debate over tariffs in the U.S. is nothing new. Fast forward to the end of World War II, and the U.S. changed its approach. After the war, with its industries now mature, the U.S. was ready to lead in free trade. Improvements in communication and transport made trade more efficient, and countries began to specialize, taking advantage of comparative and absolute advantages. It didn't hurt that many potential global competitors were still recovering from war-torn destruction. Free trade became the main economic order, especially after the World Trade Organization (WTO) opened in 1995, leading to decades of lower tariffs. Global supply chains also grew more complex. Nowadays, a finished product might contain parts from 10 or more different manufacturers located around the world. For many years, free trade shaped policies around the globe. But the picture changed when the biggest supporter of free trade, the United States, imposed significant tariffs on its largest trading partner in 2018. This action gave us clear recent evidence about how tariffs can work in today's economy. To see what happened with U.S. tariffs recently, consider the example of washing machines, a favorite semi-durable household appliance. A study by economists at the U.S. Federal Reserve looked closely at the 2018 tariff on washing machines. They found that companies importing washing machines passed on the extra cost to consumers through higher prices. Domestic producers then raised their prices too, even though they did not pay the tariff. The situation worsened because the prices of dryers, often sold with washing machines, also increased, even though dryers were not directly targeted by the tariff. Surprisingly, when taking into account the higher prices for both washing machines and dryers, the overall burden on consumers was even greater than the tariff itself, at least in the first couple of years after the tariff was imposed. Other studies by the American Economic Association and the Quarterly Journal of Economics confirmed that the entire cost of the tariff was passed on to consumers. In effect, tariffs acted as a hidden tax on consumers. Overall, the 2018-2019 tariffs resulted in about $80 billion in extra indirect taxes on Americans, one of the largest tax increases in decades. But some argue that tariffs could still be worth it if the extra jobs created by protecting domestic industries outweigh the higher prices for consumers. In the washing machine case, the tariff cost consumers an extra $1.5 billion per year, but only brought in about $82 million of additional government revenue annually. It created 1,800 new jobs in the U.S., meaning that each new job cost consumers roughly $815,000 per year, a very inefficient way to create jobs. It would be much more efficient, for example, to create these jobs by raising a value-added tax by a smaller amount. There is also evidence that tariffs can hurt industries just as much as they help them. It's not just consumers who buy imported goods, businesses use them too. Although a washing machine is a finished product and not the best example of business input, steel is a good case. In 2018, a 25% tariff was imposed on steel imports, and suddenly, the steel products that many American industries like automotive, construction, and machinery needed became more expensive. This squeezed profit margins and even led to layoffs. So, although the tariff boosted employment in the domestic steel industry, it caused a net loss in manufacturing jobs, because many industries use steel as an input rather than as their final product. This negative effect was also due to retaliatory tariffs from other countries. After the 2018 tariffs, China responded with its own tariffs targeting mostly U.S. agricultural products. This made American agricultural exports more expensive for Chinese buyers, reducing demand and lowering farmers' incomes. To avoid mass layoffs, the U.S. government had to support farmers by purchasing agricultural products and paying them directly, spending $61 billion from 2018 to 2020, almost canceling out the extra $66 billion the government collected from tariffs on China. In summary, while tariffs do bring in extra revenue, they also lead to other government spending due to retaliation, making them an expensive game of whack-a-mole. As a result, tariffs are unlikely to create the large fiscal surplus needed to support significant cuts in income taxes. It's important to note that many of these studies looked only at the first couple of years after the tariffs took effect. In the long run, factors like labor and capital can adjust, so it's possible that tariffs could bring more benefits over time as resources shift toward domestic production, boosting investment, jobs, and growth. Fortunately, there are some tariffs that have had decades to work their effects. For example, since 1964, the U.S. has imposed a 25% tariff on imported light trucks. Over the years, pickup trucks and SUVs have become the highest profit vehicles for U.S. carmakers like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, helping to keep the U.S. automotive industry strong even as offshoring once threatened it. This tariff even encouraged foreign competitors, Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW, to invest billions of dollars in U.S. manufacturing facilities, particularly in the South, creating tens of thousands of jobs. Tariffs, in this case, did exactly what they were meant to do: protect domestic industry and encourage long-term investment. However, there were downsides. With only a few companies dominating the U.S. light truck and SUV market, there was less competition, which reduced the pressure to innovate and improve efficiency. This shows an important point. For tariffs to work well, the government must ensure that the protected domestic industry remains competitive. Otherwise, without sufficient competition, companies might abuse their market power and harm consumers with high prices and lower quality. Even when a tariff is well targeted and competition exists, companies can sometimes find ways to work around it. When Mercedes-Benz opened a factory in South Carolina in 2006, the aim was to avoid the SUV tariff by producing vehicles on U.S. soil. But soon it turned out that Mercedes-Benz was still manufacturing many parts in Germany, then shipping them to the U.S. for final assembly, a strategy similar to buying IKEA furniture and assembling it at home, to dodge the 25% tariff. Over time, Mercedes-Benz has built up more local capabilities and now makes more parts domestically. But this example shows the lengths companies may go to avoid tariffs. Other workarounds can be even more complex, especially when tariffs target specific countries. For instance, after U.S. tariffs hit China in 2018, many companies moved their manufacturing not to the U.S. but to other countries like Vietnam or Mexico, where tariffs did not apply. Companies may also ship products to a third country for relabeling or repackaging before bringing them into the U.S. market. There are many options for companies to bypass tariffs, and they usually try to avoid the high costs of shifting production back to the U.S. These examples illustrate that blanket statements about tariffs, often made in politically charged debates, ignore many details. Trump, for example, has talked a lot about tariffs, but he hasn't been specific about which tariffs he wants to impose. This lack of precision makes it very difficult to predict the economic impact. If you were to impose universal tariffs on all goods coming into the U.S., then any benefits from protecting domestic industry or boosting government revenue would likely be outweighed by higher costs for inputs, more expensive consumer goods, and retaliatory actions by other countries. This net negative impact could happen both in the short run and, possibly, in the long run. So why wouldn't tariffs benefit the U.S. economy now, when they seemed to work so well in the 19th century? Back then, global transport and communication were slow, products were simpler, and domestic labor was cheap. Today, transportation and communication are fast, products are much more complex, and labor costs in the U.S. are high. Free aid has enabled complex products to be made through international supply chains. Manufacturers today are highly specialized, and many rely on heavily subsidized industries with very lax labor laws in developing countries. This setup makes production efficient and keeps prices low. The reality is that for many industries, it has become too expensive to move production back to the U.S. on a large scale. Companies may choose to avoid tariffs by moving production to another country, or they may simply pass the costs on to American consumers. This would just shift money from consumers to the government without necessarily creating jobs in the U.S., which is the whole point of the tariffs. Tariffs remain a useful tool in today's economy, but they need to be used carefully and targeted specifically, rather than applied broadly to all goods. If tariffs are applied to items that the US cannot realistically produce, then the costs, such as higher input prices and increased consumer costs, could outweigh any industrial or fiscal benefits. To reduce short-term economic shocks, tariffs should be planned carefully and introduced gradually, much like Hamilton did, so that the market has time to adjust, rather than facing sudden, huge tariffs that undermine trust and leave industry leaders uncertain about their next move. Even with these challenges, there are still markets where tariffs might be necessary despite the costs. As the global landscape becomes more tense and unstable, many countries feel uneasy about depending on politically unreliable partners for essential products. Relying on other countries can be a weakness, especially for strategic sectors such as semiconductors, energy, vehicles, railroad minerals, and food. If a major conflict or crisis were to occur, one of the first actions might be to stop trading with an adversary. Without proper preparation, this could leave a country unable to produce the goods needed to support its population and defense. When national security is at stake, the debate around tariffs shifts from purely economic issues to geopolitical concerns. For this reason, we have created a second part for this video on our sister channel, Context Matters. That video explains why major global powers are moving toward protectionism after decades of free trade, and how this trend connects with rising nationalism and the risk of conflict. You should see a link to that video on your screen now. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.